I'm a partner with EY Aberdeen, leading our audit practice. My focus throughout my career has been on the energy sector, both in upstream and supply chain, from entrepreneurial startup businesses right through to multinational firms. I was delighted to be asked to chair this network, especially at such a critical time for the sector. With the new UK government, the first Labour budget in more than 14 years, and upcoming Scottish elections, there's sure to be a lot to talk about. The renewable energy sector is not just a cornerstone of sustainable development, but also a critical driver of economic growth, environmental stewardship, and energy security. We're at a crucial point where the decisions we make and the actions we take will have lasting impacts on our environment, economy, and society. AREG and the Policy Network provides a unique platform for us to share knowledge, exchange ideas, and build partnerships that will propel the renewable energy sector forward. I therefore encourage each of you to share your insights and contribute to the dialogue. With that in mind, I'd love to hear from you with suggestions on topics you'd like covered or speakers you'd like to hear from, so please feel free to get in touch. For today's event, we've lined up a fantastic panel of speakers who will reflect on what has come from the iconic Red Box last week. There's perhaps little doubt that the Labour government have inherited a challenging position, and the messaging leading up to the budget was all about stimulating growth while making difficult decisions on tax and spending. But will the measures achieve that growth, or will the economy remain stubbornly stagnant, or worse? To kick us off for today, we'll be hearing from Moray Barber, who will give an overview of the budget announcements and his reflections on what this means for the energy transition. We will then hear from David Stevenson, Head of Regulation and Policy at Bluefloat Energy Nadara. David will explain their offshore projects and how they form part of a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Scotland. And finally, Gillian King, Group Strategic Growth Director with 360 Energy, will outline the 360 Energy growth journey and how it aligns with the aim of delivering clean, affordable energy. We'll wrap things up with a Q&A session, so please think about what you'd like to ask the speakers as we go through the presentations. So without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker. Moray is an EY tax partner and leads the Aberdeen office. An international tax specialist, he has over 20 years of advising clients, working with both multinational and privately owned groups with a focus on the energy sector. A proud and passionate Aberdonian, Moray is committed to ensuring EY continues to play a vital role in supporting the regional economy, be that as an employer, advisor, or supporter of investment into the city and shire. Over to you, Moray.
Thanks, Gemma. Appreciate the introduction. Very much proud and passionate Aberdonian. I'm glad you called that out. So today we've got 15 minutes just to quickly canter through some thoughts on the budget impact from an energy perspective. So I'll touch quickly just about EY before we get into that. High level thought around the macro and kind of economic challenges that the government were facing on the way in. Some broader comments around the key headlines coming out of the budget, because whether that's energy or related, a lot of that does relate to corporates, organisations, entrepreneurs, etc. And then finally, just some thoughts around the government's approach around to energy transition and where I think things are heading. What was good, what I'd like to see more of from the budget, and the rest of the time that Labour are in government, and future governments after that. So quickly, a bit about EY. We are a global professional services firm. We've got an office here in Aberdeen. We've got offices around the UK as well, Scotland and Glasgow in Scotland. 4 main service lines that we look at. Probably people might, we call ourselves EY, formerly known as Ernst & Young. Probably 2 pillar sector offerings that people would know us best for. So assurance, so that's the audit function. Tax, which is my speciality, but we also support our clients on strategy transactions, so looking at M&A and looking at some kind of cross-border restructurings, those kind of things, and also consulting, so business consulting, people consulting, risk consulting, etc. So Sally, if you could move on to the next slide, that would be great. So on the budget, as you'll all know, the UK autumn budget was delivered by Chancellor Rachel Reeves on 31st October, and focused on the government's aim really to deliver economic stability whilst also setting the government's growth programme. And if we were to draw out some key themes or key headlines, two words stand out for me: difficult decisions. That was said multiple times by Rachel Reeves. If you were to do a word cloud of all the things she said, then difficult decisions would loom large right in the centre of that cloud, surrounded by other words such as investment and phrases such as long term. The headline measures were broadly anticipated, and for those tax professionals out there, back in the day, we didn't really know what was coming out on budget day. It would be a bit surprised. Nowadays, things are trailed well in advance. So some of the measures announced last week, we had a reasonable sense of what was coming. From a business point of view, the key headline really was the employer national insurance contributions rising to 15%. For small businesses, obviously the employment allowance that was increased to £10,500 per year. And a week on from the budget, along with the changes to inheritance tax, the employer NIC increase seems to be the change that's caused the most upset and ripples outside of the energy sector. On the NI piece, when you look at the economic analysis, basically, essentially what's happened is the increase on employers' NI effectively negates the impact of the NI reduction on the employee side last year. So the burden has been taken away from the individual, transferred to business, which is another overriding theme of last week's budget, as you'll see. So Sally, if we could move on to that next slide. Thank you very much. So going into the budget, the government had two challenges to face and two rules they wanted to follow. Challenge one, they had inherited spending plans of previous government, and that put a lot of pressure on different departments. And those day-to-day spending plans were pretty aggressive, so they had to try and meet those. And secondly, government investment has been shrinking over the forecasted period, and the new government needed to increase government investment to try and deliver the long-term growth that we all hope for. Two rules that they had to follow as well. So rule one, they were only going to borrow to invest, and rule two, they had to keep public finances on a stable trajectory and aim to have that on a downward slope in 5 years' time. So what we saw was a big increase in spending, roughly 2% of GDP. Half of that spending would be matched by increased revenues, and the rest would come from borrowing. And that day-to-day spending, the big increase, really focused on health and education, to something like half of the increase in spending this year. Next slide, please, Sally. So just quickly touch this slide. I thought it was quite interesting. On the left-hand graph on the slide, you'll see that relative to prior years, measures introduced in the budget provide a boost to the projected growth, so 0.5 percentage point, with a focus of that growth being on the near term, providing a kind of near-term uplift, particularly over the next, kind of 12, 24 months. However, what remains a bit of a worry for me as a tax professional is the UK's fiscal position kind of still challenging. UK debt is still high, debt costs related to that are elevated, and inflation still running above 2%, well down from previous highs, but still 2%. So we can see the UK's fiscal policy is still going to need to tighten over the next few years. Next slide, please. Now, hopefully you can see here that the OBR was relatively optimistic, though, around GDP growth, 2%, and that's based on, similar to what we were predicting in our EY Item Club economic report as well. So we feel we're kind of tracking at that kind of 2% GDP growth, which is good. And interestingly, post-budget, we also continue to see scope for the Bank of England to reduce interest rates and into 2025. So no kind of immediate knee-jerk reaction or change to that, which had been trailed before the budget, post the budget announcement. So I think that's really positive. So to recap, day-to-day spending plans being matched broadly by tax rises. Tweaks made to the fiscal rules allow for increased investment to be met by additional borrowing. And whilst the UK's fiscal position remains challenging, growth is still expected to be around 1.5% and interest rates expected to fall. So that's a very high-level economic review. Let's move on to some of the fiscal changes announced in the budget as they impact companies. So let's start with corporate tax. And as expected, the Chancellor announced the publication of a corporate tax roadmap. We love a roadmap in tax, and reconfirmed that the corporation tax rate would be capped at 25% for the life of the Parliament. Noting here, I would say that 25% remains the lowest in the G7. Whilst some tax reliefs that we rely on in the corporate tax world are being retained. So full expensing of for some capex expenditure, the £1 million annual investment allowance being retained, and also current rates for research and development R&D reliefs will be retained. So a focus really on what will not happen rather than what will. Just to touch on a couple of points there. The roadmap also proposes development of new process for increasing tax certainty on major investments. That is really important for energy transition, large energy projects, so that is welcome. Again, I'll come back to that later. Some technical points around financing and funding and the way the transfer pricing rules work. Again, with a tax head-on, I won't get into the detail today, but that is seen as quite positive for us in terms of funding future investment. So let's assume there'll be investment coming into the UK for energy projects. These changes around transfer pricing, advanced pricing agreements are all welcome. So there's a real focus on stability, certainty, and predictability, and that was a key theme. And I'll come back to that when I touch on energy transition impacts more broadly. So on other corporate tax changes, again, well trailed. The rate of energy profits levy, the EPL, will increase to 38%, and that will be extended by one further year to March 2030. There's been plenty of commentary, advance of the budget around what that might do to potential investment into the sector, but also how that might impact oil and gas companies who will be investing in technologies, clean energies, which will support the energy transition. The response from government was to remove the 29% investment allowance, and we were expecting that. There was some concern that the 100% first year allowance would be taken away. We're pleased to see that was retained along with decarbonisation relief. What was really welcome, the government will provide relief for certain payments made by oil and gas companies into decommissioning funds where assets are transferred for use into carbon capture, usage and storage activities, or CCUS, to maintain the tax treatment had these assets instead been decommissioned. It will also exempt associated CCUS receipts received by oil and gas companies from the EPL. And of course, the government recently announced it reached commercial agreements to support the first tranche of CCUS projects in the UK, and confirmed in the budget that nearly £4 billion have been allocated to that initiative in 25-26 as part of a broader £20 billion funding commitment for CCUS. In terms of the North East, unfortunately, the ICON project is not included in that first tranche of projects, but we hope to see that being included in future tranches down the line. So Sally, if we can move on to the next slide. Very quickly, the Labour Party in its manifesto said there would be no changes to income tax, and this slide confirms that. Conscious of time, so I won't say anything more on that piece. And then if you can move to the second point, from what did change for individuals was the capital gains rate. So I have to say we were, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, probably, let's put it that way, were concerned that the rates might go up closer to the income tax rates. So when the capital gains tax rate on disposal of things like shares, second homes went up to 24%, whilst it's a rise, it's that is probably business owners, entrepreneurs taking some of that hit that I talked about at the start. The feeling was those rates might have actually gone up to a higher rate. I think just one to watch in the future. pleased to see the retention of business asset disposal relief. Again, that was a concern from commentators that might have been taken away, but it remains. Next slide. So, energy transition talking points and some musings and observations of what it might mean. I think essentially the budget and soundings on the energy transition, it's a bit muddled and a bit unclear, would be my personal take on it. I'm sure they would say the opposite from a government perspective, but for me, there's nothing here in the budget that really dealt with the demand aspects of energy usage. So, for example, thinking about what the budget announcements as a package and a macro level economic perspective, we have the energy profits levy being increased, the rate increased in the extended time. And that's clearly designed to tackle domestic production by oil and gas operators in the UK. But at the same time, fuel duty was frozen, which arguably might increase demand. So it doesn't feel particularly joined up at that macro level. That said, we're the retention of the decarbonisation allowances and the 100% first year allowances goes some way, I think, to encouraging oil and gas companies to continue to invest in the North Sea and also invest in new energy technologies. So let's use the government's focus on corporate tax and our three themes of stability, certainty and predictability and see where they might hit the mark, and if they were to fill out an assessment form where it might read room for improvement. So stability, I think the announcement of the industrial strategy and a long-term industrial strategy is really welcome, and I don't think anyone will disagree too much with me when I say that we all thrive on stability and long-term thinking, particularly for significantly large infrastructure projects. So things like we shouldn't take for granted the fact that the 25% corporation tax rate is being retained for the duration of the Parliament. That is quite an important statement, particularly where we might see some turmoil at a macro level globally over the next few years. So I think that is a commitment that I would welcome, certainly for all our corporations. Certainty. So the indication that the government would consult on a successor regime to energy profits levy post 2030 is welcome. I hope this first suggestion means that the government will meaningfully engage on fiscal policy, not just on oil and gas as the basin matures, but more certainty for the regimes as we go through. I know there's a lot of work being done around CCUS and fiscal policy and what that means. The same goes for other regimes. So I think the move and the statement that real consultation will happen in advance, I think, does certainly help with certainty and will give the energy sector far more comfort that the government is meaningfully engaging and is looking to that long term. Again, really important. Investment zones. There's a degree of nervousness ahead of the budget about what the government might say or do about the investment zones, but really pleased to hear that the government will continue to honour their commitment to the investment zones and the free ports. On the energy transition, the importance of free ports cannot be underestimated, and not just the free ports, but all the port infrastructures around the northeast of Scotland and further afield. And maybe we'll touch a little bit on that when we later. But I think that's really, really important. Aberdeen's northeast investment zone. Being one of those, EY are currently supporting the stakeholders in the investment zone work to define the tax sites, and certain gateway tests are going through there. So assuming that is up and running into 25-26, I think the zone will have something like £160 million to encourage investment into the energy transition here in the northeast of Scotland. So that's really important. And continuing that theme, the announcement of GB Energy clearly being headquartered in Aberdeen, the proposal to ring fence 125 million for the establishment and early operations of GB Energy is really welcome. And one would like to think that given the location and proximity of GB Energy being here, you'd love to see collaboration there with the Energy Transition Zone and once up and running, the new Northeast Investment Zone. There's lots of areas where you'd think that should all encourage people to work together for the greater good and to make that energy transition happen. So we shouldn't underestimate the statements about the retention of some of these things. However, all I would say there is that there still is what I would like to see is greater policy certainty. And whilst I'm delighted, for example, to say, okay, there's a continued commitment to R&D tax relief in the corporate tax roadmap, that's great. What more could the government be doing around emphasis on new tech, clean tech, which is going to deliver the energy transition? So any kind of tax relief around that would be focused on the early adoption, acceleration of a new technology and energy transition to help us get to net zero would be really welcome. So I'd love to see more on that. And finally, predictability. This is all about attracting big investment into the UK. The government did signpost some consultation to developers and investors around this. There's also hidden away in some of the detail, some consultation around what costs might qualify for capital allowances at the early stage of these large projects. So how do we treat planning costs, for example? Will that qualify as for capital allowances so that there's some tax relief there? That also is welcome. And again, I think is pointed towards, well, a long-term strategy around attracting big investments. And then I think just to close out, from a renewable energy perspective, scaling up those projects and energy generation is important. The government did acknowledge the importance of nuclear in Britain's future energy mix. In that regard, the budget announced 2.7 billion of funding to continue Sizewell C's development through to 25-26. And finally, there's some commentary in there around investment in electrical vehicles infrastructure and the funding support for, I think it was 11 green hydrogen projects confirmed in the budget as well. That's great, but what does this actually mean in practice? So particularly when it comes to the green hydrogen support, I want to see and hear more from the government on a longer term perspective of what's actually going to happen and where that funding is going to come from. So in conclusion, government's hands were tied when it came to having to raise taxes to ensure day-to-day spending, and business is taking the tax burden for the most part in that. Long-term growth and a new long-term industrial strategy has to be welcomed, and business investment, it takes a long-term view. We need the government to take a long-term view as well. The EPL changes broadly, whilst unwelcome, but frankly, withdrawal of any more allowances would have been far more damaging. And so let's hope that what comes to pass from a government's perspective, in the hope that those allowances have been retained, we'll see that in practice. Some really positive announcements around CCUS, funding for new hydrogen projects, and acceptance that they need to consult with business on any new tax regimes for the energy sector has to be welcome. It's long overdue. The entire sector relies on confidence to obtain investment that we need. And it's essential for the rest of the world to view UK PLC as being certain and stable. When that's the case, I'll certainly have more confidence the investment required to deliver the energy transition will flow not just into the UK, but into the northeast of Scotland. Back to you, Gemma.
Great, thanks, Moray. Really appreciated that. I'd certainly give your report card an A-star there, managing to make it understandable for an auditor. And really find it very interesting what you talk about in terms of stability, certainty, and predictability. So moving on to our next speaker of the afternoon, we'll hear from David Stevenson. So David is Head of Regulation and Policy at Bluefloat Energy Nadara. Prior to that, he spent 30 years in various roles within the Scottish Government. With a wealth of experience in the sector, David's determined to see Scotland maximise the potential of offshore wind. David, over to you.
Very much, Gemma. So just give me 2 seconds while I share my screen.
Thanks.
I'm on presenter mode, so hopefully that will kick in a second. Is it going to presenter mode? Sorry. There we go.
There you go.
I have a lag in my system. So thank you very much, Gemma, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. So, as the introduction set out, I'm David Stevenson. I'm Head of Regulation and Policy at the Bluefloat Energy Nadara Partnership. So, over this presentation, I plan to give you a brief overview of who we are, what our portfolio is here in Scotland, how it goes about actually to build an offshore wind farm, because it's not that straightforward, the policy initiatives that have taken place and been published since the Labour government came in the summer, and then a brief conclusion to that. So getting into the kind of meat of the presentation. So who are we? So as the name suggests at the top, Bluefloat Energy are, as the name suggests, a floating offshore wind developer who has around about 30 gigawatts of our projects around the world. And they have joined partnership with Nadara. Now, Nadara is a new name to maybe some of you. Recent name change from Renantis prior to that, and Falk Renewables before. They are historically a onshore wind developer and have around about 4.2 gigawatts of a portfolio around the world, mainly in the onshore wind space, as I said. However, the two have come together, as you see on the map there, for recent leasing rounds both here in Scotland, and also in Italy, with a number of projects, as you see in the southern half of that country. So coming into detail more about here in Scotland, as I said, they came together to join forces for the Scotland leasing round a few years ago. And in that, they were particularly successful, as you see, with a number of projects, which I'll go into further detail on, but comes to just under 4 gigawatts of a portfolio, of which it is likely to be all of which will be floating. So, individual projects, as I said, that were highlighted on that particular map there. So our Broadshore hub, as the detail suggests, is split over kind of 3 projects, with the main one being the Broadshore project itself. It's a Scotland project, as the slide says there, 900 megawatts, and just slightly to the north of that, it has 2 smaller projects, Sinclair and Scarabin, which we were successful in securing through the Innovation and Technology Oil and Gas leasing round, which came after the Scotland leasing programme. Sinclair and Scarabin are the in part of INTOG, so the innovation element of that, with the idea behind that these were meant to be the forerunners of the Scotland leasing round to drive forward the technology and iron out any issues before you come to the full-scale commercial arrays. Next, we have Bellrock, which will hopefully be our lead project. As you'll see from the map, it's more off Peterhead than the others, which are more heading north off of Fraserburgh. Sorry, more off the coast of Aberdeen, apologies, than of the others. This is obviously a larger project, and we are hopeful that this will, as I say, be our lead project going forward at 1,200 megawatts. Finally, we have Stromar. Now, this is a project that we're in partnership with Ørsted, who you may be familiar with, who are the world's largest offshore wind developer. We are the majority shareholder in this project. As you'll see from the map, it is slightly further north off the coast of Wick, and has recently put forward a proposal to actually increase the megawatts of this project to 1,500. So all 3 Scotland projects, in combination with the smaller 2 INTOG projects, as I said, have a portfolio of 3.8 gigawatts, which is obviously quite sizable. So how do you actually go about building an offshore wind farm? These projects are very technical, and it does take a number of component parts to come together. So as you'll see from this slide, and this honeycomb design, this is only a small piece of all the different components that you require to build an offshore wind farm, which can take quite some time to do so. From receiving your lease from, in this case, Crown Estate Scotland, to actually generating power, this can actually take 7 to 10 years, which does make some time before you're actually making a return on the level of outlay that you have to make, with no real monies coming back in until, as I say, you achieve that point of generation, which could be several years hence. But you also require the key skills that are needed to undertake this. And if you're familiar with the Scotland project, you'll be aware that there is up to 27.6 gigawatts within that project. So you're going to need a considerable amount of the skills required to actually build that out. As this graph shows, that there is some way, by the end of this particular decade, the number of people that we will require jumps significantly in a relatively short space of time, as the text shows there. But what are the skills that we do require? So this next chart actually identifies all the different kind of subsets that building an offshore wind farm is needed. And as you see, it ramps up significantly in the middle of this decade and then on into the next. There is quite a lack, as it says on the right-hand side there, of gaps currently being identified and also potentially coming forward into the future, particularly around the construction and fabrication and welding of the substructures that will be required to build out an offshore wind farm. But what are we actually doing to help in this process as a developer? Yeah, thank you. There we go. It's changed now. So, as part of the ScotWind leasing round, you may be familiar that there was a supply chain development statement that had to be submitted for each project going forward. As the slide identifies, it highlights the commitments that we, as a joint venture, have given to Crown Estate Scotland that we will deliver as these projects are built out. So some quite significant numbers. As the chart says in the middle, the text says in the middle there, we are quite a small company at this moment, but we are continuing to grow as the project evolves. And we're looking to support the supply chain wherever we can, and also at this early stage of the evolution of our projects, work with the relevant key stakeholders to identify the skills that are required, and also start in a process of training these individuals to be ready both now and then in the future, and as their learning journey continues. So as I said earlier on, since this Labour government came into power in July, and actually prior to that, there has been much said about the opportunity that floating offshore wind presents. So this next slide, there we go. This next slide gives just a flavour of the documents that have been published since the summer, to which identify the opportunity that offshore wind, and particularly floating offshore wind, presents. There is a key focus by the Labour government, and for that matter, the Scottish government, to actually seize the opportunity that offshore wind presents, both in terms of its environmental benefits as well as the huge economic opportunity. So just to focus in on some of the key documents that passed before you there in these last few on this slide here. As Murray mentioned earlier on, the Great British Energy Company was muted some time ago by the Labour government and recently announced that it was coming to Aberdeen. Now, as Murray said, this is a great opportunity for the city itself and the wider UK as it looks forward to stimulate the capital funding that is required to actually help the developer community and establish a supply chain here in Scotland and the wider of the UK to help deliver this huge economic opportunity. The next document, the floating wind anchoring the next generation offshore, really gets into the detail of how much of an opportunity this is. With the report being compiled by the Floating Offshore Wind Task Force, which was chaired by Renewable UK, identifying that it could be worth up to £1 trillion by 2050, with 47 billion of that being contributed to the UK GVA in the same time frame. So these generation opportunities don't come around that often, and this could really much be seen as the next evolution leading on from the oil and gas boom times from the 70s, 80s and thereafter. But obviously this journey is not going to happen overnight, and some key changes have to be undertaken at pace to achieve this. So in recent weeks, the UK and Scottish governments have come together in collaboration to look at the planning process that is required to actually deliver these projects, to hopefully make that system more streamlined and give the developer community more certainty in the delivery of their projects. Similarly, the UK government have asked NESO, who are the abbreviation is for the National Energy System Operator, to actually come through with a spatial plan to identify exactly where the grid infrastructure will be required to actually transport the power from the source to the actual areas of need. And finally, you need to give a mention to my old boss, Chris Stark, who has been given one of the hardest tasks, I think, as head of mission control, to actually iron out a number of the challenges that the industry face and hopefully remove barriers so that we, as I said earlier on, we can achieve both the economic and bring the environmental benefit within this nation as we move towards achieving net zero. So in conclusion, and I'll put these couple of QR codes up at the moment for those that are maybe online that are supply chain companies, please do register your interest with us and we can get back to you with the opportunities that our projects will present both now and in the coming years. But in conclusion, there are a number of hurdles that need to be overcome. And as Murray highlighted himself, one of the key factors that stands the UK in good stead is the stability in the political messaging that has come out, not just from the UK government and Labour coming in, but also the Scottish government moving forward. This gives developers like ourselves the assurances that we require and our respective boards to move forward with projects with certainty. As I said at the outset, it does take a number of years, 7 to 10 years from the start to the finish to actually build these projects. And therefore, uncertainty of the political landscape can cause people to look to other markets, as this is very much a global industry moving forward. And therefore, for Britain to retain its position as the second largest offshore wind developer with only China above us, we need to maintain that political stability to allow developers like ourselves to continue forward and keep investing both here in Scotland and in the wider UK. That's me concluded, and thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I'm looking forward to your questions later in the session. Back to you, Gemma.
Great, thanks, David. That was really interesting. Certainly taught me a few things there about development of a wind project, and good to hear some positive things in terms of the engagement that you're getting. And I was particularly interested in the points there about the skills needed and the potential for transition of the workforce. So we'll move on now to our final speaker of the afternoon. We've got Gillian King. So Gillian is the Group Strategic Growth Director of 360 Energy. She's got over 20 years experience in the sector, and she recently joined 360 from the Net Zero Technology Centre. Passionate about technology and with international experience, she's focused on the energy transition too. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thanks to AREG for the opportunity to speak today, to share a little bit about 360 Energy's journey and to share some of our reflections on the UK autumn budget last week. I think it's been really interesting that this budget has seemed to be the most hotly anticipated that I can remember. You know, everyday conversations with colleagues and friends and family, really waiting to see what the new Labour government was going to do. And although for the energy sector, we've had headwinds before, this felt like there could have potentially been an existential threat. So pleased to say that I don't think that came about, but I know it's serious when I'm having conversations with my mum about the energy profits levy. So I'm going to share some slides with you now. I think that should be okay now. I've got a couple of slides that are just an introduction to 360 and our journey of growth to date. We were founded in 2016, headquartered in Aberdeen. You can see our nice office at Annan House near Union Square on the top left picture. Owned by Simmons Private Equity, we've been on a fairly significant upward growth journey since our establishment, and that has been through establishing new commercial entities in key energy hubs overseas, and through strategic acquisitions to enhance our complete energy asset lifecycle offering. We've grown to over 1,000 employees globally. Around about half of those are based in the UK. You can see the little map there. Those people are spread across 14 facilities from Orkney to Plymouth. And our vision is really to deliver the next generation of energy services. So working in partnership with our clients and with our supply chain to safely and effectively deliver complete asset lifecycle solutions. So a quick recap on our growth to date. We started out live providing operations and maintenance services for specifically oil and gas assets within the UK. And since then, our acquisition strategy has allowed us to enter new markets, so Southeast Asia, Norway, and the US, and to enhance our capabilities and portfolio of service and products. In terms of financial performance, the diversification of our business has allowed us to not only navigate some of the challenges that the energy sector has faced over the last few years, but it's allowed us to seize new opportunities and drive sustainable growth. So culminating in 2023 being our most successful year to date, with 26% increase in revenue and 24% increase in EBITDA. And that really has come about through, you can see the spread across the kind of service line portfolio there. We're also now looking at about 30% of our business coming from non-oil and gas operations. And that's been a really natural progression as the acquisitions and the skills and capabilities that we've developed in kind of subsurface, subsea, wells, operations, EPCC, for example. There's been a really nice transition of them to the kind of new energies and decommissioning projects. We're also now less focused or less tied to UK, so 42% of our business is now overseas. So that's really important in terms of the impact that the budget was going to have on us. So although we've diversified, the UK is still a key area for us, still a really important part of our biggest business, with our headquarters and a big part of our team based here. So what came out of the budget last week was a big deal for us. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, delivered a number of key climate and clean energy announcements, which were relevant to our business. For a company like 360 that has, fairly strong ambitions to deliver the energy transition, this was all welcome news. And the language around making Britain a clean energy superpower was really positive. I think what Moray also alluded to, there was a lot of announcements around funding for the clean energy sector, GB Energy, DESNZ budget and things like that. But really for us, in the coming weeks and months, we hope it will become clearer on what that means for the sector. For the supply chain, for example, understanding what levels of funding, what types of projects will be funded, and the timeline for some of these investments would provide some guarantees on future work scopes. The support for the hydrogen carbon capture projects, again, great, 11 green hydrogen production sites and just under 4 billion investment for carbon capture. We'll hopefully get some of these nascent markets off the ground. We've had several kind of attempts at this from a carbon capture perspective in the past. And with hydrogen, there's been uncertainties around the commercial models, the off-takers, and again, the timelines for when these are going to happen. So there has been caution around investment into these to date. Again, language used around the UK becoming a world leader, leading carbon capture industry is positive, and I hope it sends the right signals to the markets, and I hope that it will unlock some of the private sector funding that we need to unlock some of the opportunities for the supply chain. Obviously, the major headline was around the Energy Profits Levy rising and being extended, and the loss of the associated investment allowance. For our business, we're really waiting to see how the operators will react to this. Each operator will be impacted very differently depending on their business and the assets they hold. You know, prior to the election, we had heard rumours of some assets going up for sale, some projects being delayed. We'd heard some of the supply chain speaking about upping resources and assets and moving them elsewhere. So I think things will fall out over the next few days or weeks as we hear the impact on the actual businesses. Again, as Moray indicated, another positive was the commitment from the government to consult with the oil and gas sector on a kind of tax regime going forward once the EPL's up in 2030. But I think we all knew this was going to be a difficult budget for the sector. I don't think there was any kind of real surprises. And the 100% first year capital allowance and decarbonisation allowance may prove to be a lifeline for many. I added a short note on the Scope 3 emissions at the bottom. As on budget day, the consultation opened for the draft EIA guidance on how Scope 3 emissions are being assessed from oil and gas projects. So there could be further headwinds on our way. In terms of what's next for 360 Energy, we remain hugely focused on growth here in the UK and on expanding our geographical footprint. We remain focused with supporting our clients with their digital transformation and their energy transition. And for us, that really means wind, nuclear, CCS and decommissioning. Wind is a really interesting growth area for us, and obviously there have been delays in planning approvals and getting projects off the ground to the scale and pace that we need. So it was really positive to hear some of what David spoke about there. And we really hope that some of the significant investment that the government are allocating for clean energy projects will unlock the conditions for these project developers to support grid connections, that private sector investment and supply chain opportunities. So one of the acquisitions that we made a couple of years ago was an onshore O&M business in Orkney. We're really keen to use that as a base for our operations on offshore O&M business, both in the UK and globally. We see that as being a huge skill that we can export. So we've been putting a lot of work into our wind business, forming strategic partnerships. We've developed some pretty cool technologies for offshore wind turbine installation. We've been doing work with the European Marine Energy Centre in Norway around some of their green hydrogen and renewables testing projects. And we were delighted to sign a kind of multi-million-pound contract with Sumitomo to design and deliver their cable storage carousels for the power cable factory in Nigg. So we really hope that the work that's been put into this now will put us in a good place as the kind of market matures, and that we hope that we can deliver some of the local content that the project developers are so looking for. It also helps us to not only grow our business locally in Scotland and the UK, but it allows us to help continue to provide highly skilled jobs. It allows us to continue to provide opportunities for apprentices and graduates to make sure that we have the skills to develop not only the energy that we need and use today, but the future energy mix of tomorrow. So just to close, a final note, we've spoke a lot around uncertainty and stability over the last couple of years for the sector, and a lack of clarity really around support from governments going forward. So I think now we have some of that clarity, and we have an opportunity as a sector to reset. I think we can show what the sector can do, what good looks like, what we can do to deliver cleaner, affordable, secure and homegrown energy. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you, Gemma.
Thanks, Gillian. That was really interesting. And I think it's particularly important what kind of to draw out there the impact on the wider supply chain, because while things like the EPL gets the headlines for large operators, I think bearing in mind the impact that it has right across the sector is really important. So it was great to draw that there, and appreciate as well a pointer to some of the other things that are still to come in the sort of policy arena, things like Scope 3 emissions. It's something that I've been dealing with many of the clients I work with as well. Right, we'll open the floor at this point to any questions. Feel free to pop them in the chat, or if anyone's feeling confident and wants to come off microphone and onto camera, then welcome that. I've had a couple come through direct, and I've got one in the chat just now, which I think Moray would probably point to you if you are there. I can't see you at the moment. Ah, you're back. So does tax relief apply to P&A decommissioning work? CCUS aside, while wells are permanently abandoned, the non-producing fields are a quantitative part of transitioning away from oil and gas to new energy. So do operators get any incentive to invest in this mandatory activity?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. The way decommissioning works for tax purposes is pretty complicated, and it's probably worth saying the point around CCUS that was mentioned in the budget last week. That has been introduced because there was some debate in the legislation, in the tax legislation, about whether if companies chose to kind of transfer a field that could be used for CCUS or develop it themselves, whether the expenditure on that would qualify for some tax relief and decommissioning relief for the companies. So it's been brought in to try and fix an area where there was some doubt, but yes, operators, where they choose to decommission a field, they'll be able to claim the cost of that as a deduction, and there's also some loss carryback rules to the extent that, as you can imagine, when you decommission an asset, there's kind of a significant amount of cost involved in that, but which you might not be able to offset against taxable profits. So there are rules for operators to be able to carry those tax losses back to offset against prior year profits.
Thanks, Moray, and hopefully, Kelly, that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Great. David, you mentioned about the, I guess, the skills gap that your sector's facing. So do you think there needs to be anything more done in terms of investment to bridge that identified gap?
As I said, I think the key point here is for skills, there needs to be a job at the end of it for those individuals where they are setting out in their journey through college or university, or those that are maybe already in employment, whether that be oil and gas or coming out the armed forces, that there is an opportunity for them to be there. So as a developer community, and as I highlighted in the presentation, we are doing our best to put measures in place that will hopefully give the people the relevant skill sets they need, or bolt-ons to the current skills that they may have. I think anything with this industry, you can always do more, you can always invest more. Government has a part to play as very much as the developers have to as well, by creating that stability that is required to move forward and giving positive messages. But there does need to be, and running in parallel with all of this for the offshore wind developer community, and for any industry for that matter, that the planning process and in our particular case, the grid connection dates, and then the contract for different process is undertaken as streamlined as it possibly can, to ensure that the positive messaging comes to the developers and our backers, that they are willing to spend more money at these particular key milestones along the journey. So, as I said, we're working very hard with those providers of skills, and whether that be the colleges, universities, to ensure that we are getting the right people in place. But I'd say the other end of the other side of the coin, there needs to be certainty that these jobs are going to happen for these individuals to make that jump across, if you like.
Yeah, understood. Gillian, there's a question about whether or not you spoke obviously about the diversification that 360 has had between UK and international aspects of the business. Do you still see a strong future for the business within the UK, given all of the sort of fiscal uncertainty that perhaps has happened, but then the changes that have come, perhaps as you pointed to, giving you a bit more stability going forward? What's your kind of view there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're hugely committed to the UK, and we see significant growth opportunities here. I think, decommissioning was mentioned there. We've seen that as being an opportunity going forward. There's a lot of work to do in the decommissioning space. And that's certainly somewhere that's a key part of our portfolio. And we've also kind of, along with the diversification from oil and gas, that includes the renewables piece. Obviously, offshore wind is key. And, I still think we are at the moment seen as being leading in terms of offshore wind, but also on just general energy transition. In my previous role, we had delegations from all over the world coming to see what we were doing in the UK in terms of emissions reduction, energy transition. So I think for the moment, there's still huge opportunities to develop the skills, the technologies, the capabilities here within the UK, growth in the UK, and then export potential on top of that.
Good. It's good to hear. Moray, another one for you. How do you see the measures being taken for CCUS to affect the willingness of oil and gas companies to adopt these strategies and solutions?
So I think, as has been said earlier, every company is slightly different, right? And it's got different aims and objectives around what shareholders wants to achieve. So let's assume the question relates to a company that is, that does see that as an important part of its longer term future. The change in legislation does facilitate, or from a tax relief perspective, I think is helpful if companies do want to invest in carbon capture, using storage, or has assets in fields that can be redeployed in that space. So in that sense, that's it's a helpful move. Anything which removes kind of uncertainty or potential blockers to from my perspective, CCUS is a really important thing to happen for the energy transition, and so I think that the changes on that sense are positive for those entities and those organisations that see that as part of their future.
Good. A big question here, and we've got 2 minutes to go, so you can take this. It's an open one to any three of you. Are the government doing enough? So I don't want to volunteer to battle that first. Moray, you're not on mute, so perhaps.
Okay. I think, it's hard to define enough, right? But as I said earlier, there's the commitment to consult. I suppose that exercise involves, always told when you go into a meeting, you've got one of these in two years. So listening is the most important part. So are they doing enough listening? And then hopefully are they listening and listening hard and then thinking about that long-term strategy? I would love to see more of that. And their commitment to consultation suggests the government will be doing that. There's a real frustration, I think, that it needs to be joined up, right? This whole discussion around energy mix, we can't have ideology driving everything. So we need realism, and we need practicality, and those three things we said at the start. And if those are the government's commitments, then that will deliver what we need, I think, for the energy transition. But they need to put their money where their mouth is. Would be my honest, my Moray Barber opinion, not necessarily EY words.
David, were you going to add anything to that?
Just I would agree with what Moray said there. The government does appear to be listening and consulting, and that's a good thing. I think it's when they then take that back in-house and digest the commentary that people have provided that they actually act upon it quickly, and not to dither, for want of a better word. Especially the opportunity in our space is here and now, but there's plenty of other countries around the world that are looking to target offshore wind, floating offshore wind, as an economic opportunity. So therefore, as I said in my presentation, the UK is currently in second place as the largest market. We can't afford to lose that, because these opportunities don't come around very often. And with our oil and gas heritage as an example, we have the tools at our disposal to actually help with that energy transition to come across. And we can't be seen for, as it has in certain elements, of items coming from around the world and being deployed off our coastline and not actually getting any benefit. We as a developer are trying very hard. Gillian mentioned Sumitomo, for example. We are looking to work with them to go forward. So companies that are coming here, there is an opportunity. It's just the need to get the right signals for government that that opportunity is going to be here for the longer term.
Great. Well, on the note of not dithering, since we're at the top of the hour, thank you very much to our panel of speakers. Thank you to all of our attendees. It was a really great event and good to see you all.